Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. As you doubtless know, the most controversial document in America remains totally mysterious. It's only 4 pages long. It is classified. That means while many are talking about it, and they are, virtually nobody has actually read it. It's a memo. It's prepared by the House Intelligence Committee, and apparently it describes surveillance of American citizens in this country by our own intelligence and law enforcement agencies. Several Republicans who have seen the document say it exposes massive and terrifying abuses of our civil liberties, presumably committed for political gain. They say the memo shows how the Obama administration used the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act not to protect this country from foreign threats like terror, which is its purpose, but to spy on rival campaigns, the Trump campaign in particular, and to create a pretext for the current independent counsel investigation, the one that has mesmerized our political class and all but paralyzed our government. It's going on over a year. Even today, the president was responding to questions about it. Watch.
One more quick one. Do you believe Robert Mueller?
I only repeat for the purposes of making sure you understand.
One more quick one. Do you think Robert Mueller will be fair to you in this larger investigation?
We're going to find out.
Are you concerned about it?
Because here's what we'll say, and everybody says, no collusion. There's no collusion. Now they're saying, oh, well, did he fight back? If you fight back, is that obstruction?
Sir,
you fight back, John. You fight back. Oh, it's obstruction. So here's the thing. I hope so.
So how do you define collusion? And Matt Gaetz asked this earlier during the briefing to Sarah, but how do you...
You're going to define it for me, okay? But I can tell you, there's no collusion. I couldn't have cared less about Russians having to do with my campaign.
It's all we talk about in Washington, pretty much. So if it turns out that this whole investigation is a politically motivated sham, that'll be newsworthy. In the words of one sitting member of Congress, quote, when this memo comes out, people will go to jail. Now, those are strong words. Is the memo that damning? Honestly, we don't know. We have no idea. Like pretty much everyone else in Washington, we haven't read a single word of it. But we certainly take the idea seriously, and why wouldn't we? The most destabilizing thing any government can do is use law enforcement as a political weapon. That's when the police become the secret police, and suddenly you're no longer living in a free country. It happens all the time in other places. Our founders were worried about that happening here, and the rest of us ought to be worried too. A rogue FBI is a far bigger threat to you and your family than any buffoonish tweet from the Oval Office. It actually matters. It could wreck everything we've built here. So this is not a story we ought to ignore. The public deserves to know, needs to know what's in that memo. This is our government. We have a right to know if it's representing us or if it's lying to our faces. If there's corruption, expose that corruption. Transparency is the only antidote. Now, you'd think everyone would agree with that sentiment. Pretty commonplace. And by the way, when you think about it, what exactly is the counter-argument against that? Secrecy is good? People shouldn't know if their government is corrupt? More darkness and deception, please. Even in Washington, you can't say those things out loud, though many would like to, trust me. So instead, Democrats on the Hill and their many handmaidens in the media have a new argument. You're not allowed to know what's in that memo because Russia. Seriously, that is the case they are now making, as of yesterday. Senator Dianne Feinstein and Congressman Adam Schiff, Democrats both from the state of California, are warning that if you want to read that document, that memo, which, by the way, was prepared by the U.S. government for American lawmakers, you are somehow in league with the Vladimir Putin regime. Yesterday, those two sent a letter to the CEOs of Facebook and Twitter claiming that calls to release the memo are, quote, an ongoing attack by the Russian government through Kremlin-linked social media actors directly acting to intervene and influence our democratic process, end quote. Got that? Anyone asking for more transparency from this government, and that would include elected members of Congress and this show, among others, anyone who's doing that is participating in a foreign propaganda campaign that hurts America. In other words, they're traitors. The implication of Schiff and Feinstein's letter is that Twitter and Facebook ought to do something to help, by the way, quickly. Like, I don't know, censor the accounts of anyone who wants to see the memo. You'd think the media might have a big problem with all of this. For centuries, the American press has fought efforts by politicians and those in power to hide unflattering information about themselves. That was noble work. It's the reason that the press is mentioned in the First Amendment. But they're not doing that anymore. On television today, you heard famous anchors make the opposite case. They suggested that calls to release the memo are simply tactics by right-wing crazies and Vladimir Putin to undermine America because they're unpatriotic. And that's when you knew it was over, the long and worthy tradition of journalists as watchdogs, holding the powerful to account. Turns out the journalists have switched teams. They're with the powerful now. They'd like you to shut the hell up. Congressman Matt Gaetz represents the state of Florida. He joins us tonight. Congressman, thanks a lot for coming on.
Good to be on, Tucker.
Now, you have read this memo. Assure us that it's not being oversold. You think this memo will change the conversation about how surveillance is used against American citizens?
I absolutely do, Tucker. And there are two things that the American people should evaluate when they read this memo. The first is you've got to evaluate the memo in the context of the 5 months of missing text messages between Peter Strzok and his mistress, Lisa Page. You can't evaluate those two things separately. They have to be evaluated together. Second thing, the American people should watch.
I beg your pardon. Let me just stop you there. How are those connected exactly?
Well, Tucker, again, I can't get into the specifics of precisely that connectivity. I can only say that I don't think it's an accident that Strzok and Page, who were volleying text messages back and forth more than a high school cheerleading squad, all of a sudden have a 5-month black hole in the middle of that exchange right at the exact time that one would anticipate a conspiracy would be ongoing to undermine the president, ending in the appointment of Robert Mueller conspicuously the very day that the Strzok and Page text messages come back online. So it's no coincidence. The second thing you've got to evaluate is the manner in which evidence presented to the court was corroborated. The problem with lies is that you got to keep telling them. You can't just tell one lie. You have to then use other lies to corroborate your existing lies. It's my position that the Mueller probe is intractably infected, that it is built on a rotten foundation, and that it should end immediately so that we can focus on the real challenge of reforming the FBI and the Department of Justice so that this never happens again under a Republican or Democrat administration.
So, and that's right. It's a bipartisan concern because what you're suggesting is corruption so deep and menacing that every American ought to be really upset about it. Can you pledge as a member of Congress that you will do everything you can to expose this and, let people make their own decisions about whether it's appalling or not? But don't you think it's important for our citizens to have faith in their government? And in order to have that faith, they need more information soon.
Well, absolutely. I haven't been in Congress for a very long time, but I don't think you solve a lot of problems by having members of Congress meet with each other behind closed doors and share their outrage with each other. I think we've got to have sunlight, transparency, so that we can all have a national debate about what type of government we want to have, what type of surveillance system we want to have, what type of information has to corroborate the stuff that is presented to courts before people's liberty is impaired. And so I think that that's an important national discussion to have. And I think the only way we're going to get there is by releasing this memo. The good news is that Devin Nunes and the members of the Intelligence Committee on the Republican side want to do that. The Democrats are all over the place. I have a hard time keeping track of where they are. First, they vote against allowing members of Congress to see it. Then they now apparently have their own memo, which is just a ludicrous proposition.
I mean, it would be interesting. We can't successfully get any Democrat on the show to explain. It would be interesting to hear the argument against releasing it. But am I mistaken in remembering that the FISA law was just reauthorized by Congress? I think that's right. Wouldn't it have been helpful to have this argument before that happened?
I would have preferred that, Tucker. It is important to note that the reauthorization of FISA was not a blanket reauthorization. There were additional due process protections that were included. That was specifically for the 702 section of FISA, which deals with overseas collection of intelligence. And when we release the memo, we'll be able to see how that precisely interacts or maybe doesn't interact. But again, can't confirm or deny those details.
So the rest of us are getting really anxious, not because of partisan reasons, but because you want to trust that your government's law enforcement agencies aren't being used for political purposes. Really simple and important. When are we going to see the memo?
I think that we'll see it within the next 2 weeks. The important thing is that now Democrats are making a claim that the memo is conclusory. So I think Chairman Nunes is right to look at what supporting information can be released along with the memo that validates it. I think that will help us to be able to have a more robust fact-based discussion rather than just lobbing conclusions at one another. And that's why the memo hasn't been released yet. I think the chairman and the committee are rightfully going through that process so that we don't disclose sources and methods or put Americans who are downrange in any jeopardy, but that we absolutely expose what I believe is a deep-seated corruption that has really undermined this presidency, unfortunately.
No, I think that's wise. The intel community specializes in releasing their conclusions without telling you how they got there, and it does not inspire trust. Congressman, thank you very much for coming on tonight.
Thank you, Tucker.
And you thought digital was forever. That's what they tell you. Turns out it's not true when it comes to the federal government in the middle of a scandal, though. The FBI now says it lost thousands, somehow, of text messages between Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, relevant to the conversation we're having tonight. President Trump just reacted to those missing messages just moments ago. Here's part of what he said.
I do worry when I look at all of the things that you people don't report about with what's happening. If you take a look at, the 5 months worth of missing texts, that's a lot of missing texts. And as I said yesterday, that's prime time. So you do sort of look at that and say, what's going on? You do look at certain texts where they talk about insurance policies or insurance, where they say the kinds of things they're saying. You've got to be concerned.
Well, it's not even the first time the government has mysteriously lost communications central to an investigation. You may remember Lois Lerner over at the IRS and how 24,000 of her emails were accidentally deleted somehow, and then, of course, Hillary Clinton's 33,000 deleted emails. Tom Fitton is the president of Judicial Watch. He lives in a world where emails are mysteriously deleted. He's dealt with this a lot. He joins us tonight for Perspective. Tom, my impression was, and our cybersecurity guys are always saying, if you write it down digitally, it never goes away. Why is that not true for federal documents in the middle of investigations?
Well, it's only true if it's convenient to withhold the information from investigators and the American people. In the case of Lois Lerner, they told us, well, we didn't keep some of her emails and there are no backup tapes. It turns out there were backup tapes, and we ended up getting a lot of those emails. With Hillary Clinton, we asked for Clinton emails. They said, well, there's nothing to give you. Turns out she had them all. She tried to delete half of them. And we now are getting the emails that she deleted or otherwise hid. So this is just a matter of law enforcement going in and recovering this material, if indeed it needs to be recovered, or finding it where it's hidden. And if I were the Attorney General of the United States, I would be very concerned about what the FBI did here, and I would send in independent law enforcement like the U.S. Marshals to secure and recover this evidence.
I'm a little confused, though, because these are not favors people are asking of the government. If you're a member of Congress on a committee investigating something, or if you're a citizen filing under the Freedom of Information Act, you have a legal right to these documents. If a government bureaucrat lies to you and withholds them, what's the penalty to him for that?
Well, there could be obstruction of justice, obstruction of Congress, destruction of government property, government records.
Are charges ever brought on those grounds?
They are, if you're not Hillary Clinton.
Were they in the Hillary case or the Lois Lerner case? Did anyone go to jail for
no.
lying about that?
No.
Huh.
No.
What's your best guess here? I confess I'm not an expert on digital questions, but 5 months of emails disappearing from an agency that's famous for understanding how digital matters work, it's hard to believe. What do you think the truth is?
Well, I think maybe there was a technical glitch, but there was little interest in resolving it, and little interest in resolving it still, and it's only going to be resolved with significant law enforcement interest. And I don't think the FBI can be trusted to investigate itself, and this is why we need independent law enforcement, and Congress ought to initiate its own inquiry as well. But this is pretty serious. These text messages are about the activities of FBI agents who have been implicated in massive abuses of power at the FBI, have ruined the Clinton investigation in terms of its credibility, and in many ways this isn't even about FBI texts. This is about the Mueller investigation, because Peter Strzok, who's at the center of this, was the key investigator in the Russia collusion investigation. Who knows what evidence he has gathered as a result of his partisanship that has now been tainted. And I think there's this race going on at this point where Mueller is trying to get Donald Trump interviewed before this memo comes out and before more text messages come out that further undermine his already really low-quality investigation.
The president could declassify it by the end of the show.
He could click his heels 3 times. We could get the underlying FISA warrants rather than relying on Congress to write a memo about it.
We ought to. Tom, thank you.
You're welcome.